Venezuela's Attorney General sends a letter informing the U.S. Congress of the mercenary raid on Venezuelan territory. And it also says Colombian drug traffickers knew about the terrorist plot against Venezuela. And we have the latest from Brazil as the Congress receives a new petition to impeach President Jair Bolsonaro. Welcome to Telesul. I'm Carla Gonzalez. This is from the South. The government of Venezuela presented new evidence of the failed attack by U.S. and Colombian mercenaries. The Vice President of Communication, Jorge Rodriguez, denounced a link between the attackers with the Colombian gang Los Pachencas. He also denounced a link with Operation Gideon with drug traffickers in Colombia for the supply of weapons. Rodriguez said parts of the Colombian armed forces knew of the conspiration against Venezuela.
We have audios that have reached us, not only due to leaks, but by indignated voices inside the Colombian armed forces who see the alliances between those armed traitors and deserters who are training in the northern region of Colombia, with the drug traffickers that supposedly the government of Colombia is combating, the drug traffickers that allegedly the DEA is combating. And Donald Trump announces operations against drug trafficking, but it seems that it has achieved the opposite. It has strengthened the powerful drug cartels in northern Colombia.
In a video confession, one of the U.S. mercenaries said opposition member Juan Guaidó hired Jordan Trudeau for a terrorist incursion and that he chose him due to his proximity to U.S. President Donald Trump.
Guaidó chose to work for him.
Why?
Because he believed that Jordan Trudeau had close ties with Donald Trump and the United States government.
Do you think they have chosen Jordan Trudeau because of his proximity to Donald Trump?
Yes, it would seem that that's the impression that Guaidó has.
Are you aware of how much Guaidó paid in advance for training, weapons, and other logistics?
Before I was made aware of more information here, I was not, but I assumed that he was funneling money to support the mission.
Venezuela's Attorney General Tarek William Saab has indicated that he sent a letter to the President of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to officially inform Congress on the mercenary raid on Venezuelan territory on May 3rd.
Last Tuesday, a letter addressed to the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, was sent and received. We provided information to the United States Congress on the events surrounding the so-called Operation Gideon, which was nothing more than an incursion to the massacre, to generate a massacre, to commit terrorist acts by mercenaries hired by a United States company.
In other news, the lower house in Brazil received a new petition to impeach President Jair Bolsonaro. Over 400 political and social organizations, including the PT and PSOL, asked the legislative body to begin a political trial against Bolsonaro. They accused Bolsonaro of political crimes, diminishing public health, and risking the lives of citizens in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic. Currently, almost 300,000 people have been infected by COVID-19 and 20,000 people have died in the country. Let's turn to our correspondent, Brian Meir, for more.
At 11 o'clock this morning, a coalition of over 400 civil society organizations and political parties filed an official impeachment procedure against far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro for putting people's lives at danger during the coronavirus pandemic. Now, there are already impeachment requests against Bolsonaro sitting in Brazilian Congress, and Bolsonaro has recently allocated 80 billion reais in funding for pet projects from all of the different congressmen in order to try and buy their support against the impeachment. But what makes this request different from all of the others that preceded it is that it's part of an actual social movement, and the idea is that together with this impeachment request, there's other activities that are going to happen. First of all, Congressman Paulo Teixeira also introduced last week a constitutional amendment which would immediately call for reholding the elections in case of impeachment. The PT believes that it isn't a step forwards to remove Jair Bolsonaro and put military General Hamilton Mourão, who is his current vice president, in power. So part two of the fight is to cancel the 2018 presidential elections for fraud, and there's ample proof that fraud took place. Finally, this impeachment request is connected to a national campaign called Out with Bolsonaro, in which all of the civil society groups that joined in the impeachment request today will work to pressure people in their communities, to educate the people about the dangers that Bolsonaro is wreaking on Brazilian society through his disastrous handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And the hope is with that, his popularity levels will be pushed down below the 20% mark. Currently, he's polling at around 27%. And it's of the opinion of the PT and the partner organizations that the impeachment won't be politically viable until this number drops below 20.
That was Brian Mir in Brazil. Hundreds of doctors fighting COVID-19 in Ecuador have taken to the streets following health measures, of course, to protest against layoffs. Several workers in the city of Puerto Viejo protested after at least 400 doctors were notified that they will be laid off. This follows an announcement by President Lenín Moreno that he will impose austerity measures, including laying off thousands of workers in the public and private sector due to the economic crisis, which he said was triggered by COVID-19. Meanwhile, hundreds of workers protested in the capital, Quito, against a law passed by the Assembly. The new labor reform reduces working time and wages and follows recent cuts on education. Some of the protesters said they were afraid of getting infected with COVID-19, but were more afraid of hunger and unemployment. They demanded job stability for workers and teachers, saying education should come first.
We have come together to reject these measures that only bring hunger. As teachers are very vulnerable. Our rights are being violated. Our salaries are currently reduced, and we have to pay for the resources to teach our students. It's been 4 years since our salaries were raised to meet the minimum wage. And now the government says it will reduce our working hours and salaries to avoid layoffs. But that's a lie. A lot of teachers are being laid off, and we don't have substitutes for them. We call on the government to realize that it is education that promotes development, and it should not be left behind. The future of Ecuador is at risk.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. In Bolivia, evidence continues to emerge regarding the purchase of medical equipment at inflated prices for the treatment of COVID-19. For this, the de facto government's health minister has been removed from office.
Hours after being taken in by police to provide statements along with 4 other officers, Bolivia's Minister of Health, Marcelo Navajas, was removed from the position.
The president has dismissed Minister of Health Marcelo Navajas in order to avoid any type of interference in the work of the justice system or the investigation.
According to official information, each of the ventilators, with its minor contribution to the fight against the coronavirus, has a price of just over $7,000. But the Bolivian government has purchased them for nearly $28,000 each.
The issue of lack of transparency, the act of not communicating well, of not informing the population adequately, has its price, and this is the price Bolivians are paying, unnecessarily.
Lawmakers aligned with the de facto president Denis Yanez fear that there will be more irregularities.
We've been given the information that it seems as if overpriced beds will be arriving from China based on beds which are produced in Bolivia for hospitals. Let's be honest, we have to remove these authorities. This is the time because we have to give a signal beyond the corruption, a signal to the people so that we can go out into the streets with calm.
The movement towards socialism, which is the legislative majority, has demanded that the authorities responsible for these attacks on the health and the economy of the nation be criminally prosecuted. They have warned that Foreign Minister Karen Longerek is also involved, as she was advised of the costs by the consul in Barcelona.
She herself says within the note that the operation that being carried out was at risk due to a supposed sale of the same respirators for half price. This same note, which was sent by the Consul General of Bolivia in Barcelona, mentions that on May 11th, information had been forwarded to Mrs. Karen Longaric.
The Inter-American Development Bank, which provided the money for the transaction, endorsed the operation. This leads to another unresolved issue, the lack of testing needed to know the real situation as it pertains to the pandemic in Bolivia.
Now to Guyana. The recount of votes cast in the March 2nd general elections continues, with 71 ballot boxes tallied on Wednesday at the end of day 15. Guyana's Elections Commission began a 25-day recount to declare a winner starting May 6. The total number of boxes recounted so far is 789 out of 2,339. In an effort to speed up the process, GCOM's chairperson announced plans to ask the National COVID-19 Task Force for 2 more workstations. 8 ranks attached to Guyana's Presidential Guard have tested positive for COVID-19. The police force said the tests were conducted randomly and the patients have been quarantined. However, the Director of Public Information and the Ministry of the Presidency assured that the ranks are not part of the Special Protective Service arm of the unit, so they were not responsible for the close protection of President David Granger, who has been working remotely, nor his family. Antigua and Barbuda's Prime Minister Gaston Brown has rejected the U.S. decision to block medical supplies from reaching some Caribbean countries to combat COVID-19. He spoke during an exclusive interview with Telesur.
And I thought it was somewhat myopic for them to have intervened and to stop those shipments, because they were not significant. They would not have made a difference in terms of the health response within the United States. I think it was very unfortunate, but notwithstanding that, we were able to get supplies elsewhere to the extent that our pre-COVID situation, which was very vulnerable, we would have strengthened our health infrastructure.
Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness said he is mourning the deaths of 153 elderly women who died in a fire 40 years ago. The fire ravaged the Eventide home on May 20, 1980. Holness described this as a heartbreaking catastrophe and a dark time in the country's history. He promised to never let such an incident happen again. He tweeted, "Today I honor the memories of the beautiful souls we lost and pledge to do all we can to protect and care for those in state or private care facilities for the elderly." Cuba's scientific community is continuing its work to look for alternative ways to fight COVID-19 as the nation grapples with the pandemic and unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States.
In under 7 days, in a biotechnology center outside of Havana, scientists created a transport method that could conserve the virus known as SARS-CoV-2, using it for the more than 80,500 tests taken on the island.
This product is often imported, but due to the global crisis, most of the nations that manufacture the product were not allowed to export. That's why, under these shortages, we designed our own method.
The cotton swab used to take the sample in each PCR test is placed in this container, which prevents contamination during transport. In Europe, each of these costs €40, but thanks to Cuban ingenuity and the use of national products, demand will be met.
This is one of the products that we are producing for the fight against COVID-19. We guarantee the entire life cycle of this product, and it is made under the required quality guarantees.
Biomodulin T was also created in these laboratories back in 1994, and it's one of the drugs that is part of the medical protocol in Cuba to use in treating COVID-19. To this day, the protocol has been used on over 5,000 people over 60 in retirement homes.
It creates different reactions in the immune system for that it's used to treat infections in senior citizens.
After 2 months since the first reports of COVID-19 cases on the island, one of the best experiences in treating the virus happened when a patient was diagnosed in a retirement home, thanks to Cuban-made medicine and outbreak was averted.
China has committed to assisting Caribbean countries affected by COVID-19. Tian Qi, ambassador of China to Jamaica, said on Wednesday that the Chinese collaboration will be material and technical assistance, the sharing of lockdown experiences and treatment solutions, also facilitating the purchase of medical supplies. The ambassador also said China will actively expand all-round practical cooperation with Caribbean countries in areas like trade and investment, and strengthen communication and coordination in international and regional organizations. And on Wednesday, China delivered a donation of medical supplies and financial resources to assist Cuba's battle against the novel coronavirus. During a ceremony at the Cuban Health Ministry, Chinese ambassador to Havana, Chen Ji, noted that the recent address by Chinese President Xi Jinping during the 73rd session of the World Health Assembly offered important guidelines for the future fight against the pandemic. Ambassador Chen delivered the materials and funds donated by the Chinese Red Cross to the Cuban authorities, including COVID-19 test kits, face masks, and surgical gloves, among other personal protective equipment.
This year marks the 60th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Cuba. In the midst of the growing uncertainties and an ever-changing world, the importance of the traditional and fraternal friendship that unites us has been further highlighted. We will continue to support the efforts of the Cuban people in the fight against COVID-19, and we are ready to work together to promote exchanges and cooperation in various sectors. We are convinced that Cuba will overcome this epidemic and continue with firm steps in the construction of socialism. China has been an example of how to act in an area as complex as the epidemic, contributing experiences, providing resources, and sharing its experiences as the first country that was subjected to the epidemic. We followed the statements of the Chinese president, we support them, and we know that they will be a faithful reflection of what China represents for the world in this great battle.
We'll be right back after this break. Thank you for joining us again. 20,000 indigenous people in the Amazon region have been infected with COVID-19, according to the Pan American Health Organization. It warned of the high numbers and the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on indigenous people. The organization called on countries to protect their most vulnerable population. The Amazon area is made up of Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Guyana, and Suriname. Kenya's Ministry of Health has increased testing for COVID-19 as the country has confirmed more than 1,000 cases. Healthcare workers on the front line were among those screened for the virus. The ministry announced plans for mass testing after increased reports of asymptomatic cases. It said high-risk clusters would be prioritized, including slum areas, hotels, hospitals, quarantine centers, and isolation facilities.
We have had to really increase our aggressiveness in dealing with infection prevention and also specifically tailored to COVID. That means screening of every person who walks into this hospital, whether it's a visitor or an actual client. They have to be screened. We have controlled movement within the hospital, controlled distance in our waiting bays, and even extremely restricted the visits into the hospital.
The landfall of Cyclone Amphan increased the death toll to 80 on Thursday after battering India and Bangladesh. Amphan leveled thousands of homes, flooded streets, uprooted trees, collapsed buildings, and left cars window deep in water. The worst damage was reported in India's Calcutta. Many villagers ignored calls for their evacuation as they feared they could be infected with the coronavirus. And several organizations, international ones, are nominating the Cuban medical brigades for the Nobel Peace Prize for their work fighting COVID-19 around the world. 26 brigades of Cuban doctors are currently working in over 20 countries and have helped almost 30,000 patients fight COVID-19. The Henry Reeve Brigades were created by the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, in 2005 and have provided more than 1,200 health specialists to treat the virus.
We are grateful to be considered heroes by so many in the world. But we are nothing but doctors, but we've had to play a large role combating this pandemic.
In preparation for Al-Quds Day, Damascus is taking part in several acts of support for the Palestinian cause. Syria and Iran also ratified their support for the fight of the Palestinian people against Israel.
Amid the pandemic, Iran participated in a virtual act for the International Al-Quds Day, which was held at its embassy in Syria, and in which they ratified their position in defending Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Palestine. They also reject the expansionist plans of Israel, supported by the United States.
The enemy thinks that because of the pandemic we weren't going to celebrate Al-Quds, but this year, in defiance of the expansionist plans of the Zionist entity, we have organized this video conference activity, and the celebration will be much more effective internationally.
We ratify our firm posture before the aggressive, colonialist, expansionist doctrine of the usurper Zionist entity, and we will unmask the truth of behind the Israeli occupier before the entire world. And we are sure that the triumph and that the definitive victory will soon be reached.
At the same time, a solidarity meeting with the Palestinian people was held outside of Damascus. Participants ratified their rejection to the so-called deal of the century and condemned plans by Tel Aviv to annex more Palestinian land.
We advocate for the unity of the Palestinian people, the Arab world, and the Islamic nation in support of the bloc of resistance which constitutes the true support of the Palestinian resistance movements.
We celebrate this date a few days after commemorating the Palestinian Nakba or catastrophe, which today they want to continue their chapters through the annexation of more Palestinian lands by the hands of Zionist coalition of Netanyahu and Gantz, under the so-called deal of the century promoted by U.S. President Trump.
This year's commemoration of Al-Quds Day occurs at a time in which Israel, supported by the United States, began the implementation of the deal of the century, as it's called, by declaring Jerusalem as its capital, and with the annexation of the occupied West Bank, the Jordan Valley, and the north of the Dead Sea. An expansionist plan that Syria and Iran will, despite all of the pressures of Washington against them, confront with unconditional support for the Palestinian people until the liberation of all occupied territories.
And with that, we end our news brief. But you can find these and more stories on our website, telesurenglish.net. And be sure to follow us on social media. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time, and stay safe.